Hey guys, I'm Jackie, senior tutor at Prepped and Polished, and you're here for another segment of grammar rules that you must know. So this week, guys, we are going to primarily look at some unusual punctuation again. This week, it's going to be quotation marks. We're going to spend a lot of time on quotation marks, how to use those correctly. And we are also going to look at parentheses and dashes, okay? Okay, if we're all here, let's get into it. All right, guys, so like I said, we're starting this week with quotation marks. So we're going to go over all the rules for using quotation marks. All right, guys, so when using quotation marks, their most common function, right, is to precisely quote someone, okay? So you're going to show the reader the exact words, okay, the person said or wrote, and this is important too, guys, in the exact order they were spoken or written, okay? So this is called a direct quotation. Okay, so the key is here, if you make any alterations, you delete a word, you shift something slightly, okay, you have to note it inside quotations, okay? So that's what I mean by the exact order they're written or spoken. Okay, so here's the difference between, guys, a direct quote and an indirect one. Okay, so the direct quote, the bank robber said, hand over the money. Right? So in this scenario, okay, these are the bank robber's precise words. Okay, in the second example here, okay, the indirect quote, as opposed to a precise quote in quotations, we're paraphrasing what he said. The bank robber said to hand over the money, okay? So he indicated this. He said something like, give me the money, okay? But only in the top quote, the direct quotation, are we sure exactly what he said. In the second quote, right, it's more like hearsay or you're paraphrasing, okay? So in this example, guys, right, it's quite simple. But if you're paraphrasing something for a paper or something you've written in school, right, it'll probably be far less simplistic than this example here, okay? Make sure that when you paraphrase, you still cite the evidence, okay, or cite where you got it from. You can't paraphrase, change the wording a little bit, and then claim them as your own. Okay, so they're not a replacement for citing the information. All right, so let's look at rule number 1. Sorry, guys, about that. Not sure why it went backwards. Sorry, guys, hang on 1 second, just having a technical error with the PowerPoint. Okay, so it looks like we're up and running again. Sorry about that. Okay, I think I've over-clicked. Or is it just running? Okay, sorry about that, guys. So our rule number 1 is if you're using quotations to show dialogue, right, so a conversation, you have to enter down every time a new character is talking. So if it's a simple conversation, it might seem like this is unnecessary. Do I have to enter down? Okay, but if you have a set of dialogue and you're going in between characters, unless you name them, it has to be clear who is speaking. Okay, so let's look at this example from Gatsby. Okay, so this Sister Catherine sat down beside me on the couch, okay, and then they have this conversation. Do you live down on Long Island too, she inquired. I lived at West Egg. Okay, sorry guys, I don't know why the PowerPoint's doing that. Okay, really, I was down there at a party about a month ago, a man named Gatsby's, do you know him? I live next door to him. Well, they say he's a nephew or a cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm's. That's where all his money comes from. Really, she nodded. I'm scared of him. I'd hate to have him get anything on me. Okay, so in this conversation that gets fairly complex, it wouldn't be entirely clear who's speaking always, right, unless the dialogue entered down, okay? All right, guys, so next rule. So if you're writing dialogue on your own for the previous one, make sure you put spaces, you enter down whenever you shift between characters. Okay, guys, so this is probably one of the most important ones, and the most common errors come from this rule, not knowing this rule, okay? So when you are using quotation marks, Periods and commas almost always go inside closing quotation marks. In other words, right, if you have a full sentence you're quoting, the period goes inside the quotation. Okay? Semicolons and colons go outside the quotation marks. So if you have, a statement and then a colon and then the dialogue, that dialogue is outside of the quotations. Okay? And then I often get questions, guys, when you see this, periods and commas are inside the quotation marks. What about exclamation points or question marks? So it depends. If the dialogue, if someone asks a question, right, if the punctuation is relevant to the statement, that goes inside. So she exclaimed something. Okay, if the exclamation belongs at the end of the sentence and you're quoting something inside it, right, then it can go outside. Okay, so for here, guys, with the pause in the middle, she said, I hope you can stay for dinner. Right, for this pause, this comma, okay, belongs in the quotation marks. However, I just want to note, okay, closing quotation marks. So what I mean by that, guys, is a closing quotation marks is going to be the ones that end up on the right side that end the quotation. So you should have a comma or period, right, after no and dinner, but not after she said. This comma stays outside the quotation marks, okay? So make sure you remember that distinction, that the punctuation only belongs in the quotations when it's the closing quotation mark. Okay, and then let's look at a more complex example. This is like if you were writing maybe a paper for school, okay, and then we have this colon outside of it, guys. And remember, I know we already went over this, but in order to utilize a colon in this way, you need a full sentence before it, okay? So Ray Bradbury frequently uses figurative language to enliven his stories, okay? So then we have the colon and the quote, okay? And I don't know if you can see this gap between in the start of the quotation, guys. That's an error. You never want to have, sorry about that, you never want to have a space in between your quotation marks. So it towered 30 feet above half of the trees, a great evil god, folding its delicate watchmaker's claws close to its oily reptilian chest. Each lower leg was a piston, 1,000 pounds of white bone, sunk in thick ropes of muscle, sheathed over in a gleam of pebble skin like the mail of a terrible warrior. Okay, so aside from guys, using this quote to show you how you might incorporate, say, textual evidence into a writing paper. I also want to show you why you would utilize quotations, okay? So if I'm summarizing a point from that Ray Bradbury story, okay, so that was from The Sound of Thunder. If I'm summarizing a plot point, I wouldn't use a direct quotation. However, when I'm talking about his figurative language, there's no way a paraphrase is going to explain what that quotation did. Okay, so if you're wondering when to use, and we're going to revisit that concept again later, but does this need to be added? Does the reader need to see this direct quote or this language to better understand the point? Okay, so in this example here, arguing he uses figurative language to enrich his stories, I want a specific example of that figurative language, especially because the author's written in a way I couldn't repeat myself. All right, so let's look at rule number 3. If you're quoting more than one sentence, okay, either in dialogue or manuscript, okay, you only put the quotation marks at the beginning and end of the quote, not after every sentence. Okay, so guys, this is really important. So when you're quoting dialogue, we'll look at it differently, okay, quotes within quotes, basically. Don't worry, we'll go over it all. Okay, but basically, if you're quoting, say, a paragraph or a couple sentences, you don't put quotation marks around every sentence, right? Just at the beginning and the end, okay? All right, also, if you're quoting more than one paragraph, however, okay, you should put quotes at the start of each, right? That's going to indicate, okay, sorry, guys, I promise my PowerPoint's got a mind of its own. Bear with me here, okay? I want to see if I can get it to stay on the slide. All right, we got it. Okay, so unlike sentences, if you're quoting whole paragraphs, Okay, so this, you're probably not doing this yet, but in long, long papers you might do so. Okay, you need to indicate a new paragraph has started. All right, guys, rule number 4. So you're using quotations as well to indicate titles. So instead of italicizing or underlining, shorter works take quotation marks. Okay, so these are essays, poems, short stories. They could be like a song title or the title of an article. Okay, so if you're wondering why can't I just underline or italicize like I do for, say, a book title? Okay, the reason being is they typically come in a longer work, like a book. So you have to be able to differentiate between them. In other words, if I'm quoting a poem, that poem likely came in a book, a collection of poems. Or if I'm quoting an article from a newspaper, that came from a larger newspaper. So in other words, the newspaper would get underlined or italicized, while maybe the article would get quotation marks, or if you're quoting a specific chapter in the book, in a book, same thing, guys. So you would have underline or italics for the title of the greater work, and then you would use quotations to indicate the smaller ones. So let's look at a few examples of this. All right, and Amy Tan's short story, The Rules of the Game, explores the intergenerational dynamics between immigrants and their children. Okay, so in this example, guys, this is a short story. It comes in a larger book of works, okay, and the larger book is what gets the underline or italics. Okay, sorry, guys. Okay. In Sylvia Plath's poem, Jilted, she compares her heart to an early summer plum. Okay. So in this example, guys, again, the poem Jilted comes in a larger work. Okay. So if we quote that or discuss it anywhere else in your writing, right, in your paper, that's what needs to be underlined or italicized. Also, guys, if you use either underlining or italics to indicate titles of the big works, the textbooks or books, make sure you select one and keep it consistent. Okay, so one isn't correct over the other, but it should be the same in your writing. So if you use italics to, title one of Shakespeare's plays, you should use italics throughout the rest of your paper. Okay, and then let's look at our last example. My favorite episode of The Office, Dinner Party, has some of the show's most cringeworthy scenes. Okay, so in this example here, we're using the quotations to indicate the title, and then after that closing quotation, there's a pause, there's a comma naturally in the writing, okay, because this is describing here Dinner Party. Okay, so we need commas, and we should note, okay, the first comma after The Office stays outside the quotations, okay, but the punctuation at the ending quotation mark goes inside it. All right, guys. So rule number 5, okay, so this is about slang. If you're using slang, technical terms, or any kind of expression that's outside the normal usage, okay? So that doesn't mean specific to you. You'd have to think what the kind of general public understands as common usage, right? So this would include something you might text your friends, a specific or technical jargon like maybe in computer science, in law, certainly in medicine. There are very specific vocabulary, entire register of words for those professions. These, if you use them, right, especially in your writing and you're describing these terms, the first time you use them, they should come up in quotations, okay? All right, so let's look at examples of slang versus a technical term. All right, so Ted was getting together tonight with some of his broskies. Okay, so here, guys, look at them. They're having such a great time. Broskies is going to be, okay, the slang word, right? This isn't actually a common word. Sorry, guys, about the presentation. So broskies has to go in quotations, okay, because unlike the rest of the words in the sentence, this is slang. All right, so our next example, right, so this is kind of leaning more towards obviously technical terms, okay, habeas corpus, literally meaning you have a body, okay, means when presented to a judge means that someone who has imprisoned another person has to show the legal basis for that imprisonment. Okay, so guys, if you're quoting something or explaining a term like this, habeas corpus, it's Latin, okay, you should put it in quotation marks because it's a technical term that your reader is likely not going to know, and this indicates that. It kind of tells them, right, that this is a term you likely don't know. And then our last example, cash, okay? So cash, right, is kind of like the collection of information on a website. I'm probably still explaining it wrong, but I have a general knowledge, okay? So the collection of items in a browser, and then when you click back in, because it saved those things, right, it moves quickly. So that's what cache refers to. Again, a kind of technical term that it's very likely, or at least for me, the audience doesn't know, okay? So it belongs in quotation marks. So if you're writing a paper and you want to discuss a term that's probably uncommon, so this wouldn't be literary devices for an English class. I get that that's kind of technical, okay? So you should also know your audience, right? If the final term, for example, cache, if that were written in a computer science article designed for computer science majors to read, for example, it's very likely cache wouldn't go in quotations. But if it were in a magazine article where the general public's going to be reading it, then it would. So consider your audience as well when you're making the selection about what is a technical term. However, slang is always going to be in quotations, guys. So whether or not your audience is aware of the slang, okay, it belongs in quotations. All right, guys, I'm just going to check to see if we have any questions. Right, so bear with me. Okay. All right, guys, so if we don't have any questions yet on how to use quotation marks, we're going to keep going. We have, I think, one more rule to go over. Okay. All right, guys, so if there are quotation marks inside the quote, okay, so kind of a double quote, right? So quotation inside a quotation. This more often than not is going to happen when you're quoting dialogue, okay? So you still need to indicate, right, where the dialogue is with quotation marks, but because you have quotations at the beginning and end of the quote, the dialogue within it takes single quotation marks, kind of like the apostrophe, right? So let's look here, for example. All right, friendship is one of the most important themes in A.E. Milne's Winnie the Pooh. Okay, and then we have a bit of dialogue between Pooh and Piglet. Pooh, he whispered. Yes, Piglet. Nothing, said Piglet. I just wanted to be sure of you. Okay, so cute. So guys, in this example, right, all our dialogue, if we look at Pooh and then Pooh questioning back, yes, Piglet, they take a single quotation, but then at the end and beginning, okay, note that there are 3 quotation marks. This is to indicate one, the first quote, and then the dialogue beginning. So while it might feel chunky or look a little gross, this is grammatically correct, guys. You should have 3 at the beginning and end, unless, of course, the quotation didn't begin with dialogue. So if there was some kind of description first, like they were sitting in the meadow and then Piglet said Pooh, right, then we wouldn't have the 3rd quotation, okay? So if you don't like the way that looks, I hate having 3 quotation marks on either end of my quote, okay, look in and see if there's a way you can include, you know, part of a quote from, say, you're reading a book, a description of the scene or setting around it, basically anything that's not dialogue at the beginning and end of your quote, so you can kind of eliminate that. Otherwise, there's no other way you can get rid of it because you have to indicate that there's dialogue. So the reason, for example, like here, guys, the quotation mark rules are so specific. So why does there have to be 3 quotation marks? Can't we kind of figure out that it's dialogue? Is because when you are using quotations, right, it indicates you're repeating precisely what someone said. And if the grammar goes wrong, right, we looked at commas last week, right, Rachel Ray eating her family and dog or cooking them, whatever. that the importance of grammar, especially when you're looking at something like quotations, okay, is making sure you impart the information correctly. So if you quote someone directly and you make errors in the quotation, you put commas in the wrong places, you change one or two words, the big issue is you're changing what someone said and claiming they said it. So you want to make sure you have these precise early on, guys, because the more you quote and the more people you quote, say you're writing for a magazine, okay, and people see it, then you want to make sure it's correct. So get these rules down now, so that way later when you use quotations, you're quoting everyone right. Okay. All right, guys. So I want to go over what's the big deal. Why does it matter? Okay. So in your own writing, not just why quotation marks are important, and not just what do they indicate, kind of like we just talked about, why is it so important that the grammar is correct on them, okay, is in your own writing, it gives you the opportunity to make decisions, okay, how do you want to present information? This could be true for creative writing, so do I want to include dialogue or a thought process here? Do I want to have a direct, something spoken between my characters, or kind of just an aside, okay, as well as writing for academics, guys. So kind of like that early example we looked at with Ray Bradbury, should I quote or paraphrase? Right there, we obviously needed the direct quote. Okay, so let's look at a couple examples of how we can differentiate and make the decisions for ourselves. Okay, so if you're say in your own writing, you're describing this moment with your mom. My mom asked me what I wanted for my birthday on the car ride home. Okay. So you have the option to present this differently. I know these examples are fairly simplistic, okay, but it gives you variety in your writing later on, guys. Okay. So your other option is to directly quote that, so it's dialogue. So the mom says it out loud. Okay, what would you like for your birthday? My mom asked on the car ride home. So minor difference, but in one, what's been said is kind of paraphrased. So it's not that she said that exactly. She could have hinted at it or said, what are you hoping for your birthday? In the second example, we know that's exactly what the mom said. All right, and then let's look at another example. Fred wondered whether or not he was going to be able to graduate this year. Okay, so in this situation, he's kind of thinking on it. He's thinking in his head, okay? And then we have another example where, right, he's asking it to himself. Maybe he said it out loud, maybe he asked it in his head, okay, but this is a direct quote, okay, so he at least, said it in his head, okay. I wonder if I'm going to be able to graduate this year, Fred asked himself. So in the second example here, guys, say you're doing creative writing and you're wondering, what is the difference between these two choices here, okay. It's a little bit of character insight and how personal it is. So in the first one, he's kind of having this general consideration, he's wondering. In the second choice, you're actually seeing his thoughts. So it's a little bit more personalized, and so you have a choice there. So the big thing, guys, is the variety, the opportunity to decide, how am I going to present this? Do I want a direct quote? Should I paraphrase? Okay, so all of it's about being able to make as many different decisions as you can with your writing. Okay. All right, guys. So one of the last things I want to look at, I mentioned this early on, is deciding when. So sometimes it's tricky for students and writers to decide when should I use the direct quote and when should I just paraphrase, okay? So of course, there's no definitive rule about this. You can always quote something even if it's seemingly unimportant, and you're always welcome to paraphrase things that are weighty and important. Okay, but for kind of a general rule of thumb, guys, this is how I recommend thinking about it. Okay, so use direct quotations, an exact quote. Okay, when the source material utilizes language that's particularly striking or notable. Okay, so to me, that first example with Ray Bradbury, that was extremely striking language. I don't think I could have written it like that myself, only he could have said it that way. I think it needed a quotation, okay? So what I've said here, don't rob the language of its power by altering it. In other words, there are sometimes things that are said in a way that we won't say them better, that maybe shouldn't be altered. Okay, so let's look at an example, guys. Right? Martin Luther King Jr. believed that the end of slavery was important and of great hope to millions of slaves done horribly wrong. Okay, so this is a paraphrase of a quote we're going to look at next. Okay, and this is an example where I would recommend using direct quotations. In other words, the paraphrasing that we just looked at here, you're going to see the quote and see what it says, is not going to do the quote justice. It is not an acceptable, it's of course opinion-based, but replacement for the precise quote. So let's look at kind of the weight of the words, right, versus the paraphrasing versus the exact quote, okay? All right. Martin Luther King Jr. said of the Emancipation Proclamation, "This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice." Okay, so while the paraphrase does get the general idea of that quote, right? So you can't say it's completely different. You get the gist, okay? It doesn't replace the kind of weight and phrasing that obviously Martin Luther King Jr. came up with on his own. So if you're deciding, should I put this quote from the author, should I quote this sentence or two from my textbook, read the quotation and think, that is explained so well, I couldn't explain it better myself in my own words, or this author or speaker, like this example here, has phrased or stated that so well, so powerfully that it shouldn't be altered or changed. All right, guys, so this is our last kind of rule on quotations. So I'm just going to take a quick second to just check if we have any questions, okay? And then we're going to be moving forward with a quick quiz, actually, on the grammar rules. We'll just kind of review them really quick. So give me 1 second. All right, guys, so if we don't have any questions so far, okay, so we're all quotation pros at this point, then we should be pretty comfortable on the quiz, okay? So let's go in. Okay, I don't want to overclick. And just kind of put these things together, right? See if we can kind of put together what we've learned so far. All right, so how this is going to be formatted, guys, I'm going to put out a sentence that requires quotations but has none. I'll put in a brief pause and then, so, try to guess at home where the quotations belong, and then we'll bring them in and see if we got it right, okay? All right, so Mrs. Taylor asked, James, will you be joining us for dinner? Okay. So if we take a look at this, guys, it should be fairly clear where the dialogue is, okay? So Mrs. Taylor asked is not a part of the core dialogue, but the James, will you be joining us for dinner is, okay? So indeed, the quotations go around James and dinner, right? And then just, guys, note the end quote, the question mark is inside the quotation, okay? All right. Brandon wrote a report called The Three Branches of Government. There shouldn't be a comma there, guys, so take that comma. Okay, so the quotations here belong around the title of his report, right? So briefer works, essays, poems, songs, those take quotation marks. Charlie and Melissa both screamed, vacation is finally here. Okay, something we've all been waiting on, right? So Charlie and Melissa both screamed. Obviously, this is not the dialogue. It's the part where they are yelling, okay, the actual exclamation itself, okay, vacation is finally here. Our quotes go around that. Okay, guys, 2 more examples. My favorite song is Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles. Okay, So you should know why you need quotations around this stuff, guys. So this sentence looks awkward without some indication of what the song title is, okay? So in other words, those quotations belong around the title of that Beatles song. So kind of a theme, vacation and sunshine, right? And staying positive. All right, and then our last but not least, have you read The Giver yet? Asked Zoe. Okay, in this one, guys, we have another question. So since she's asking the question, okay, that's part of the dialogue. The question mark goes inside the quotations. Okay. And then, guys, some of this self-edited, but the asked Zoe, okay. No, that would be capitalized. It's good. All right. So how did we do on this quiz? Hopefully, because we didn't have any questions, you guys knew exactly where to put those quotation marks. If you didn't, just go back through and look at some of these slides, all right? And kind of revisit the rules. I know we went over a lot of them today. All right, guys. So the next piece we're going to look at, the other part of punctuation today, are going to be parentheses and dashes. Okay, these kind of go together. They can also go with colons. We'll talk briefly about colons, but we couldn't fit it all in. Okay, so parentheses and dashes, what are they? What do we use them for? Okay, so their primary use, the function of this punctuation, okay, or the way they overlap. We're going to be looking at first what they both do that's the same. Okay, so dashes have more functions than parentheses, and we will look at those later. Okay, but they separate non-essential information from the main clause, the body text. Okay, so let's look at the first example. The Leaning Tower of Pisa, which was completed in 1372, took nearly 200 years to build. Okay, so in this example, I know we've looked at non-essential clauses before, guys, but let's just review quick. Non-essential clauses mean anything that's not essential, not necessary, to the core meaning of the sentence, right? In other words, you can cross out the non-essential information and a sentence will still stand. So let's look at that quick. The Leaning Tower of Pisa took nearly 200 years to build. That sentence is just fine. Okay, so what we have in parentheses here, which was completed in 1732, is non-essential. Okay, with two dashes, these are going to have the same function as parentheses, guys. So you have kind of two aesthetic options for selecting how you're going to indicate information is not essential between these, okay? And then you should remember you have a third choice, right, with commas. You can put commas around the clause as well. And then just a quick note, guys, it's very common that these non-essential clauses, right, not always, but it's common they do start with W words like which or who, okay? All right, so let's look at more specific uses. Okay, so parentheses. Okay. So like we just looked at, parentheses are used to include information that's important, right? But not an immediate part of the sentence. Or, okay, so most importantly, guys, because you can put information in the following sentence, this is when you are making a statement and you just want to clarify or explain something, right, that will help clarify the rest of the statement. In other words, you feel like you need to put it here, or it's directly relevant to what you're saying, okay, but you're not sure exactly how to incorporate it into the sentence, okay? So let's look at an example of this. And this is parentheses only function, guys. They can also be used to cite information, okay, but in your actual writing, they're always going to be used together and they're always going to be used to indicate non-essential information, okay? So phone applications, which always come with in-app purchases, will spell my financial downfall, okay? And then right in our bottom left, actual footage of me making in-app purchases, okay? All right, and then company managers ignoring guidance from their investors, hired temporary workers to replace full-time staff, okay? So in both these examples, the core sentences can stand alone without the parenthetical information. So let's look at the second sentence. Company managers hired temporary workers to replace full-time staff. That's the core sentence. That is what happens, had happened, and that is what it's supposed to indicate. Okay, and then this other piece, ignoring guidance from their investors, right, is an extra piece of information. Okay, The other thing is, guys, even though this type of information here, the way it's punctuated here, is not essential, if you don't like the parentheses or you want another way to punctuate it, you can always shift the structure of the sentence. So for example, if you wanted to get rid of the parentheses in that second example, okay, you could make, say, the parenthetical information an introductory clause. So ignoring guidance from their investors, comma, company managers hire temporary workers to replace full-time staff. Okay, so if you don't like a construction, you write something, you think that seems awkward, you're not forced to do it that choice. Okay, and then just a quick thing to remember, guys, parentheses are always in pairs, so you should never have a lone parenthesis kind of standing on its own. Okay, the other thing is they can be used to cite information, right? So after you put a quote, you might put a resource where you got it in parentheses. Okay, how to cite in-text examples, we're going to go over that in a later session, okay? All right, guys, so then dashes, what do these do? So first, they do the same thing as parentheses when they are used in a pair, okay? So like the example we just looked at, we could have had dashes in both the locations you had parentheses. So let's look at an example. 3 prominent citizens, okay, and then we list them, Edwin Wilkes, Tom Smith, and Roberta Marsh were elected to the board, okay? So we still have a core sentence there, 3 prominent citizens were elected to the board, okay? So this just pulls the parenthetical or non-essential information out from the main clause, right? And just, I want you to look in, it's kind of hard to tell here, guys, but when you use dashes, and these are M dashes, in other words, they are not hyphens, okay? So a different piece of punctuation than a hyphen. There should be no spaces. I'm not sure if you can tell there aren't any, okay? But imagine you put a space between a parenthesis and the next word. That would look a little bit awkward. It's the same here. So no spaces when using the M dash, okay? And then if you're wondering what is an M dash, this is just a long dash. In other words, it's not a hyphen, okay? And this has a different function than hyphens. Hyphens connect short words. Right? And then our other function is, unlike parentheses, dashes can be used on their own, guys. So if they stand alone, right, so together they're functioning like parentheses. Standing alone, they function like a colon, okay? So when alone, they have a couple different functions, a little more diverse than the parentheses, okay? So on its own, a dash in your writing provides emphasis, okay, kind of dramatic pause, or it'll preface an explanation or definition, okay, so the same way a colon does. So let's look at this example. I was having a wonderful time until I realized a dreaded thought. Tomorrow was test day. Okay, so in this example down here, guys, there's supposed to be a dash, okay? So I realize that there is a colon, okay, because their function is the same. So going in there, I must have just naturally typed a colon, okay? So here we could have the dash as well. And what it does is it emphasizes, puts a kind of a emphatic pause between the dreaded thought and what it was, right? So a dreaded thought, tomorrow's test day, okay? So in this example here, it's emphasis, right? Or what I would say, a dramatic pause, okay? And then just a quick tip, guys. When used alone, okay, an M dash is similar to a colon and it uses the same grammatic restrictions. So if you're wondering what are the grammar rules for using that dash, okay, refer to how would I use a colon. All right, guys, so that's it for today. Today, just I want to recap. We went over some really tricky punctuation, especially how do I properly use quotations, okay? And the reason this all goes together is it's about citing other people's information, words in your own work, okay, as well as kind of injecting important information, right, those latter two pieces of punctuation into the body of your work. So when you're writing at home or when you're writing, say, for classes, okay, make sure you refer to these when you're going to say directly quote a novel or a poem you read, okay? All right, guys, so we will see you this time next week, okay? So noon on Wednesdays for version 6 of grammar rules that you must know. So I can't wait to see you guys back here next week. Thanks, guys.